Episode 16, Part 2, Devil in a Blue Dress by Walter Mosley. Welcome back to Point Blank. This is Part 2 of our discussion of Walter Mosley's Devil in a Blue Dress. My name is Kurt, and here's Justin.
Hello, people, and hello, Kurt. How are you doing this fair afternoon and or evening?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm excited to talk about Walter Mosley's work and Devil in a Blue Dress. Easy Rollins is a great character, and we're going to have some fun with him today.
We barely scratched the surface of this book in the previous episode, so it'll be fun to dive in deep. There are some cool things that are happening here, and I think our listeners are hopefully eager to hear about them.
Mosley and Easy Rollins really, they talk a lot about race in America, and that actually brings up a current, when we're recording, event in the mystery genre, and that is the Mystery Writers of America announcing and then rescinding their award for Grandmaster in 2019. And this just happened in the last couple of days. What happened here is a writer named Linda Fairstein was awarded, or supposedly awarded, the Grandmaster Award. And the membership of the Mystery Writers of America, they took to Twitter, they took to social media and attacked this decision by the committee that appoints the Grandmaster Award for giving this to Linda Fairstein, and it was withdrawn within 48 hours. So the question here is why? And that's a good question. Have you been following this at all, Justin?
Just briefly, you brought it to my attention. My first question was, who the hell's Linda Fairstein? I never heard of her or her work before. But
Me too.
Once I heard that she was influential in the mystery world, and then also in her career, her legal career, and given how important the Grandmaster Award is for mysteries. I mean, this is the award given to Agatha Christie, Stephen King, Walter Mosley received one. This is a big deal. I was definitely surprised to hear how it all played out, and glad to see why and that people spoke up when they did.
So a little bit of background here on what happened. So Linda Fairstein, I assume that's how you pronounce it. I had no idea who she was either. She writes a type of mystery that I think neither of us are particularly excited about. And all of her books, there's 20 of them, are following this prosecutor from Manhattan named Alexandra Cooper, who basically is kind of what Linda Fairstein did as a career. She was a prosecutor in New York City. She prosecuted a lot of sex crimes in her work with the New York District Attorney. And let's talk about the positives of her. Now, she's a bit of a controversial figure because on the one hand, as a prosecutor, she did a lot for women to be both heard when it came to domestic abuse cases, to rape cases, and these sorts of incidents, to let their cases get heard and get in to be prosecuted. And that's a pretty important thing. There's that element of her career. Now there's another element of her career, and I think it's not the first time we've certainly seen this, where an overzealous prosecutor may get involved in some controversial cases, and that seems to be what happened here. And this was brought to my attention. I saw it announced by Attica Locke, who wrote Bluebird, which was an Edgar Award winner for 2018. And she was the first and probably the most vocal of the critics of the Mystery Writers of America giving this award to Miss Fairstein. And the reason Attica Locke knows a lot about this is she was a writer, one of the script writers for a documentary about the case of what's called the Central Park Five. Now, where this all comes together is that Linda Fairstein, and this is somewhat of a controversy as to how involved with this case she was, but it's definitely true. She was the supervisor in the district attorney office that was supervising the prosecution of this case. And this happened back in 1989. A jogger in Central Park was raped. And these 5 men, teenagers, most of them were African-American, I believe one was Latino, were basically picked up by the police and they were convicted. What ended up happening in this case is Their sentences have been vacated. They were found to have 4 of the 5 signed confessions, but these were confessions done under intimidation. That's why this is such a big case, is that they were pressured by the police and by the DA to sign these confessions as teenagers. And it's not just them saying this. This case was overturned, and a serial rapist in 2002 admitted to conducting the rape, and his DNA matches the DNA found during this assault. So they certainly were not involved in that.
Which means from start to finish, these 5 youths were set up.
Yes. Now, just a bit play devil's advocate here is that there were other assaults in the park that were more like muggings and whatnot that happened on that same day. It's been Farstein's statement that, well, if they weren't guilty of this rape, they were guilty of these other assaults. Well, that's not what they were prosecuted for, and there was no evidence of that. So, and they were found guilty of this crime, which they did not commit. It's very clear that they did not commit this crime. In fact, they have sued the city of New York several years ago, and they were granted a rather substantial wrongful conviction award. In some of those further cases, I have a quote here that the judge went so far as to say is, "I was concerned about a criminal justice system that would tolerate the conduct of the prosecutor, Linda Farstein, who deliberately engineered the 15-year-old's confession. Farstein wanted to make a name. She didn't care. She wasn't human." And that's the judge saying that, not the lawyer or something like that. So it's pretty clear that she had some wrongdoing in this case, for sure. And she has never apologized. She's never admitted to any wrongdoing in this case, probably for her own financial reasons. But this is not the type of person who the Mystery Writers of America wanted to award a Grandmaster Award to.
I know where I stand with this, but when it comes to art, how much of one's life principles, your day-to-day ethics and code of conduct, how much of that should be put under the microscope in terms of deserving something related to one's art. And I think that the two are and should be related, especially when you're putting somebody on a pedestal. But I wonder how many other winners of this award, when placed under a microscope, might find some unsavory things that would rule them null and void in the eyes of the hive mind.
There certainly was a controversy, trying to remember exactly which sci-fi award that was, but it had the bust of H.P. Lovecraft on it, and that there was a lot of controversy about his racism and why are we giving this award out with this noted racist as a bust on the award. And it's true, like you say, like how many of these people would stand up to under a microscope? Well, if you won this in 1970, it's a very different climate than it is today. And
also, she made her literary career by writing, and I presume that her prosecutor in her novels is a upright, confident, heroic character. I'm presuming they're not a villain. So to present a character and introduce a character to the world that has these potentially noble qualities, but then to reveal or have it revealed that you were not nearly so noble and that in fact you went against the very code that you were purportedly stood by, that kind of hypocrisy tarnishes her actual literary production.
I don't know what the rules are, but I would think that a person who is getting a Grandmaster Award should elevate, not just be a good writer, but elevate themselves as a person as well. And maybe if she had given some comments about, hey, I made a mistake or whatever in this case, maybe this would be totally irrelevant. But to stick to her guns after all the evidence suggests otherwise is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, get over yourself. Hey, listeners, I once peed on the walls of a church while I was drunk. So now you know. Don't hold it against me if there are any awards I'm up for.
I'll make sure to bring that up when you're given a future award, Justin. I'll be the first.
Thank you. Yeah. It's public now, so it's fair game.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, I think it's relevant to our discussion of Walter Mosley because he's first of all, he's a very recent award winner of this Grandmaster Award, and from watching his interviews and the way that he conducts himself and the way he talks publicly, to me, he very much symbolizes what somebody who wins a quote unquote Grandmaster award should be like. He is very reflective of his work. He's very reflective of society. He's reflective of his influences. And to me, that's somebody in a lot of ways, this is, as you say, this is the biggest award, and it should be somebody who other writers, readers, and whatnot can look to as, I don't want to say a hero, but maybe a mentor would be a better way to put it. And his actions certainly speak more to that than what I know about this Linda Fairstein. Let's transition into a more positive light, which is certainly Walter Mosley's work and Devil in a Blue Dress.
Walter Mosley's A Devil in the Blue Dress. It's his first novel in the Easy Rawlins series, and it came out in, I believe, the early 1990s. It's set in post-war Los Angeles, and in the Watts area specifically, and the focus of the novel is on criminal activities, some gangster elements, and other things happening, but a lot of it's centered in the working-class black communities of the area. Now, Mosley, as Kurt alluded to in the previous episode, is a black man who grew up in Los Angeles. His parents were there, and he has experience in this world. Of course, he was born after the setting of the book, so I believe, based on what I've read, his experience comes from the stories his father told him and just from his own research. But he was born in 52. The story is set in 48. Anyway, he offers a voice that, until this series, was pretty rare in crime fiction, as some of our listeners know. The one other person who delved into issues of race to the depth that does Mosley is Chester Himes, and that was many years prior to Mosley coming on the stage. So we have a black man protagonist in a black community, a working class community, and he's struggling to get by in a world where white people hold the power. Mosley's Easy Rawlins, to me, is a love child of some of the aspects of Chester Himes that I really love, but also Philip Marlowe. There's more of a straight-up private detective thing happening here. We have L.A., and we have Easy Rawlins, who is leaving his working-class past behind, or at least his factory worker past, and deviating into what seems to be the beginnings of a private investigator career. And this is a novel that gets moving instantly. We have an origin story of Easy Rawlins transitioning out of his old life and into this new life, which is pretty cool, and I don't think we've seen that before. Now, the plot is basic. Easy Rawlins is a World War II vet. He loses his job at the factory. Page 1, he's in the bar drowning his sorrows in alcohol. And it's cool. The bar is above a meat packing plant, and it smells nasty, and so not many people go there, but it's sort of a haven for him, and it's a place to go to get away from it all. Of course, that's not how it is this one fine day when he's in there drinking. His bartender friend, his name is Joppy, he introduces Easy to a well-dressed white man, and this well-dressed white man is in a space that's not normally his, a rupture of the space and boundaries that are known in the community. So this white man enters into this bar and offers Easy a job. The job is simple. He needs to find a woman who has gone missing. And we learn later on that the woman's name is Daphne Monet, and I'll get to that in a moment. Easy hems and haws about this because he doesn't want to just dive into this new and potentially dangerous situation without understanding more of what's happening. Who is this white guy? What's his deal? And he had just recently been laid off. This is all very new to him. However, he does have a house. He's a homeowner. He comes from Houston, and he was a vet, served in World War II fighting the Germans, and he does not want to miss a house payment because there's a symbolic value, symbolic significance that this house holds for him, who is the son of a sharecropper from the South. So it is one of the many moments, this first moment and many moments throughout the book, where Mosley speaks really effectively to race and white-black and general racial relations in a way that I found to be effective and very necessary, and the key feature of this book, what really made it work. So, Easy Rawlins decides to take the job, and he begins to search for this missing woman. Her name, like I said, is Daphne Monet, and the man who gives him the job, his name is DeWitt Albright. He wants her found, and the reason he seeks Easy to do the job is because she has been heard to be visiting places where white people aren't allowed to go. She's haunting places where black folks spend their time. So Easy goes into these places and is allowed to enter into these spaces, including a speakeasy, even though speakeasies don't need to exist anymore because alcohol and prohibition, that's all gone. But this one particular establishment is still a speakeasy because the owner decided or realized that they had such a bad relationship with the authorities that they probably wouldn't give him a liquor license anyways. Easy goes into the speakeasy and sort of navigates through and meets all these interesting characters. We get the character of Coretta, and we get Junior, who Easy doesn't really like. Coretta's more of a likable woman. He ends up sleeping with her. She's actually one of the first victims in this novel. We get a few other characters, and we get just get to see life on the inside in this black community in the late 40s. And it's sort of cool to be taken into this world and see what it looks like as Easy tries to find Daphne. It doesn't take long for Easy to get into some serious trouble because just mentioning Daphne's name, it starts to percolate through the community, through the grapevine. And it ends up leading to some of the initial murders in the story. And also it gets into the ears of the local cops, the LAPD, who are particularly racist. And within a couple 20, 30 pages, Easy's brought in for the first time to the police department and he's interrogated, and some of these dynamics are really captivating and interesting, and what I believe to be the strongest features of this story. So soon he finds the girl, white woman named Daphne Monet. She speaks a French accent for a minute, and then suddenly the accent is gone. There's a dead man on her bed, and she wants to flee in a car with somebody else's $20,000. The question of Daphne's identity gets revealed later on in the story, but for now, we know that she's complicit in something. We don't know for sure what it is. Suffice it to say that she is not who she appears to be. Easy and Daphne eventually hook up. This doesn't come until much later in the book. It doesn't last because, of course, it doesn't. That's the way these novels work. The men who are seeking Daphne and who are implicated in some of these murders, perhaps or maybe not, they find Easy eventually and beat him up, and they kidnap Daphne, and all of a sudden everything starts to break apart, and we see the hero's journey. He's in a dire position. Easy has no option but to hope for the best. However, there's another element, a wrinkle to the story. He has this friend named Mouse back in Houston, and early on in the story he gets a letter from Mouse saying, "Hey, dude, I want to come out and visit." And Easy doesn't care. He doesn't want to deal with Mouse. He knows Mouse. He's an old criminal and a dangerous wild card type of character. When the going gets tough, all of a sudden Mouse becomes a thought in his mind. He's like, "Oh, wait, what about that guy? He might be handy." So he calls Houston in probably the 2/3 point of the book and calls for Mouse and says, "Hey," doesn't talk to him, talks to his wife or his ex-wife and says, "Hey, let Mouse know that I need his help." And then we let it go. It's one of those threads that we know is going to recur if the plotting's okay. And it does. However, I did have a problem with Mouse conveniently coming into the story to save the day, so to speak, when Easy gets into some trouble. It felt a little bit too obvious, a little bit too telegraphed. But we'll let it go. So when the going gets tough, Mouse shows up. He kicks some ass. He does some shenanigans and acts funny and says some funny things and is like uber violent and doesn't seem to have much in terms of moral scruples, which is a nice foil to Easy, who's a little bit more reluctant. This is where, in the last 30 pages, this novel goes from well-paced and maybe not perfectly plotted, but I felt like I liked where it was going. Then the last 30 pages, suddenly the novel just goes off the rails and becomes like, I don't know, weaker pulp fiction, let's call it. There's a rush finale. Everything happens too fast. There's like a victim and there's a bad guys and there's shooting and there's fisticuffs and there's running and everything happens really quick, almost like Mosley had to like finish the book by midnight or he turned into a pumpkin and all of a sudden he races through to the end in the last few pages. I didn't like that. I think it was a problem. But on the whole, I enjoyed this book. I think Rollins is an honest, interesting character, and the social commentary on race in Los Angeles was really well done. Ultimately, I hope that Mosley keeps working on stuff like The Devil, and he does with Red Death and future books. I anticipate, and I imagine it will be true, that his plot work will tighten up as he becomes more finesse-y and tighter as a writer. Long story short, this is a good book. It's not a great book, but it's good and promising, and I'm drawn to the series, and I'm curious to know what he does next. I give it 4 hits, just like last episode, and I'm willing to stick with that. Even though Kurt had mentioned that he was wavering 3.5, I can see where he's coming from. I had the same problem with the Chester Himes book we read for different reasons. But ultimately, I'm willing to stick with 4 because maybe it's just a flash of green syndrome, because that book was, I wanted to punch it to death, that this book is so refreshing and it takes me in a new territory. For that, 4 hits. Kurt.
Yeah, I did waver on my score for this book, and the more I think about this, the more I'm gonna go with the 4. I'm gonna stay with a strong 4, and I think I think that's because of all the interviews that I watched of Mosley's in the last couple of days, and knowing that this character and this series progresses so much. And I know it gets better. I do. I mean, I don't think it certainly doesn't tail off. And I think if what he says is in his interviews, even remotely comes through in his writing, the things I liked about this book only become stronger. And for that, I'm going to go ahead and stick with the 4 on this, because it might not be the best start for the series, but it's a good start. And it's good enough that I'm going to read more. I'm really interested in the second book, A Red Death. And, I'm going to keep going with it. So I think this was a strong book. I enjoyed the characters tremendously. I think that for the most part, his characterization is excellent. I think Easy is a great character. I know that Mouse is a fan favorite and a reoccurring character throughout the series, as is Edda May. In a lot of ways, like Chester Himes, we're getting a lot of characters. There's a very good neighborhood community feel to the characters in this book, and I really enjoy that. They're not just thrown in there as supporting cast that we've seen in other books, but they actually feel like people who would exist in this community.
There are many really interesting, cool characters, and they're lively and colorful and distinct. And you mentioned that the characters feel like a community, and I totally agree. That's unique to this, and I guess Chester Himes, and I imagine that there's a reason for that. And I think some of it is that it runs contrast to the alienating aspects of some of the early detective fiction. I mean, Raymond Chandler's a loner, and the Continental Op is largely a loner, and there's these alienated white men operating in a world where there's no meaning, and they try to make sense of the world. It feels very nuclear family, very capitalist sort of family structure, and the disconnection that occurs in modern society, whereas this clashes with that and says, no, like, there's a community here, and we need a community in order to survive. And that's often the case in marginalized groups. You need to stick together, be a team. Of course, the characters, and we'll talk about specific characters that we like, but the characters in general in this book, they could all be still two-dimensional. Mosley didn't have to make them interesting in a way that holds our attention or keeps our attention for long, but he managed to make that work. We don't see characters for long, but they really have a purpose. We get Joppy, who's involved in the plot. He's the bartender early on. We get Coretta, who's a friend of Easy, who gets the plot really moving, and they have some good dialogue. We get Junior, who's like the guy that Easy doesn't like, and there's a cigarette that's important that he smokes that comes to play later on. And then we get Mouse, who's, like you said, a fan favorite. He's the wild card. He reminds me a little bit of, later on, the Spencer books, Robert Parker Spencer. And I think we should do one of his books one day, because I really love that series. I would call it probably a third generation detective fiction. Spencer has a side character, or like I guess you call it a sidekick, named Hawk, who serves the similar function, who's refreshing, who does things that the main character does not, challenges the main character, and keeps that energy or tension going. So I think I like Mouse. I mean, I don't like how Mouse was put into the story, but I like what Mouse brings to the overall feel of the book. Which character stood out to you or drew you in?
Boy, that's a tricky question, because so many of them are compelling, even the ones that are, well, to not give too much away, but are essentially disposable in this book. It would make sense to make the characters that are going to be reoccurring throughout the series compelling, because you want people to enjoy them. Joppy is not going to last through this book. We'll just put that out there. But yet he's still interesting. And I kind of I would have liked to hear more from Frank Green, who is the black gangster. He's in there and he's interesting, but we don't really get a lot from him.
No, he's off the page for much of the book. We hear his name more than we actually spend time with him.
I would have liked to seen a little bit more of that. In the interviews that I watched with Mosley, he talks a lot about both Easy and Mouse in particular. And, some of the interviewers were asking about, well, would you ever do a book from Mouse's point of view? And I thought it was interesting what Mosley said about that, in that, he really likes Mouse as a character, but he identifies that Mouse is a psychopath.
Yeah. And
I'm sure that comes out more in later books. And from a different writer, maybe Mouse would have been the main character. For many of our writers, but for Mosley, one of the things that he's trying to do with his writing, he identifies that there's plenty of fiction out there that has a black male protagonist, but there's very little fiction out there with a black male hero.
Yes.
And he sees Easy as the hero. And maybe we can get into what Mosley's definition of a hero is in a little bit. And this is in a future book. I forget which one, but some character makes the comment to Easy that, hey, you're the most dangerous man in LA. And Easy's like, well, I'm not that dangerous. And the response from this other character is, no, it's not you. It's because everybody trusts you. And this character goes on to list characters like Mouse and some other characters that come up in future books. But he's like, all of these super dangerous people respect you. It's about the respect and about the community that Easy sustains around him that makes him who he is. And I don't know if we see that in this book per se, but it's interesting to see that the series overall, there isn't necessarily one character that stands out. It's the cast of characters that create the strength of Easy Rawlins.
It is really an ensemble that operates in this book. Easy takes the center stage. We get to meet Coretta. We get to have some one-on-one dialogues with her, and I'm like, oh, she's sort of compelling. And, well, I'm sorry, folks, but she doesn't last very long. We hopscotch from one character to the next, all part of the greater community, contributing their own 2 cents to the conversation in this book before they disappear and are replaced by somebody else. And that way, it's sort of cool how he manages to do that and hold the narrative together. I never felt like, oh, this novel suddenly feels broken or missing a key component. I didn't get that impression because a new character would come in and fill the void and feel like they're in the right place. At least in the black community, I had some trouble with, like, we had the racist cops, we have the white badass gangster who's operating on the top, we have a couple other folks. There's one character that I struggled with, or maybe I didn't read right. What was going on with that pervert who was running for mayor? There's a whole plot thread about this weirdo pervert who had like a little Mexican boy as a sex slave or something.
Yeah. That was weird.
I was like, what the fuck is this? And why is it here? And to be honest, I speed read the book today just to get a sense of it again. I still was like, what is that doing in this book? And what purpose does it serve? Did I miss something?
I can't even remember that guy's name.
Jonathan Kazan, I don't know.
The mayoral candidate. But you're right. Why is there this weird, like, pervert, pedophile, basically, character in here? And it really doesn't make sense. What came to mind to me was, like, maybe it was some sort of weird homage to the Maltese Falcon.
The guys in the hotel room?
Yeah, with Gutman. Yeah, it was overdone. And I think I noticed in the preview, I did watch the preview for the movie. I think they removed that from the movie version, which might have been a good call.
Maybe that was a first novel blunder where Mosley was trying to cram too many plot threads in to hold our attention. But then at the end, like, it really had no bearing on the plot, the climax. You mentioned that you liked Easy. Is he a good character, a great character, or a...
In this book, I think he's a good character. I know that when Mosley sold this book, it wasn't necessarily intended as a series, but when he sold the book, they would only publish it if there was a second book in the series because it's a mystery series, right?
Sure.
If this was a standalone book, I probably wouldn't be as interested, but I think he does put a lot of building blocks in this particular book to create a great series character. So I'm excited to see where Easy goes. I like the fact that for once we get a detective who isn't a former police officer, didn't formerly work for the DA, he was in the military, but that was a lot of people's experience at this particular point in history, that he's an everyday working man who ends up in this situation. And I really enjoyed the commentary, or I guess the inner monologue of Easy as he comes to terms with the fact that he's being a detective. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not working for somebody else anymore. I'm working for myself. I'm making decisions on how I go about my workday on my own rather than what the boss tells me to do. I know that experience, from reading history was very difficult for a lot of African American men who served in the military during World War II, to go to places, especially in Europe, where they didn't see the discrimination that they saw in the United States, and they had more responsibility and all of these things. And then to come back to the US and have a lot of those things essentially stripped back away from them, that was a very difficult experience. And the inner monologue of Easy, talking about his work experience, talking about how important it is for him to be a homeowner, those things were really powerful.
Oh, I totally agree. I think what Easy as a main character brings to the novel in terms of conversations about contemporary issues is terrific, and I would read him just for that sake. As an individual, as a person, as a character, as a hero, I think, yeah, he's a work in progress. But what we get from him in this first book that we don't get from some of the early private detective stories, for example, Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, those books, we get a history from this guy. We don't know where Philip Marlowe came from per se, just that he had a job once, but we don't know anything about his past, about his family, about his community, about his culture, where he comes from, and what he thinks. We just get the now. With this guy, with Easy Rawlins, Ezekiel, we know he's from Houston. He has a rooted community there that he's left. He has this moment serving in the war where he transcended race and became a team player in a war for quote unquote democracy, and then he has to come back and reap the harsh realities of returning to a place that's essentially still encased in that racist mentality. And we know so much about him in this first book because we get these little vignettes or moments every other chapter where he flashes back to the war, and we see him engaged in struggle during the war, and then all of a sudden he's in the present. And we also get him, and this is sort of like a cool stylistic thing. I'm not sure if it works for me, but what Mosley does is he'll have the character Rollins talk to himself. Like, so Easy Rollins is looking in the mirror and he says, "Hey, what do you think about this?" He says to himself, and then he talks to himself. And this is all in dialogue. Like he's having a conversation with himself in dialogue as opposed to having it be a thought bubble. And I think that was sort of interesting too. You get to see his thinking process aloud, which is a cool thing that he does. And I guess it helps us to understand how and what Rollins is thinking, which goes against the old Western code of not really knowing what your protagonist is thinking or doing. Just have them spit and let the wind sort of sweep at their hair in their silence, like the dramatic silence of it all. I like knowing who this guy is. I like knowing that he has a past. And I like knowing what he sacrifices for the sake of whatever it is he believes in. We don't really understand his moral code, but we do know that he has reluctance and he believes in something.
I think it's interesting that Mosley puts Rollins into LA in this time frame. And of course that's Mosley's family experience, which makes a lot of sense. But the whole idea, and this is again a comment based on my interest in the series, is that he talks about this black migration from the South, particularly Texas and Louisiana, into LA. This goes also to that homeownership ideal, and that Easy, I believe that Easy says this in the book about how, well, in LA, you can, as a African American, you can get any job, you can buy a home, can do all of these things. It's still going to be extremely hard work. And at the end of the day, even though you're going to be able to get all of these things, you're still going to be at the bottom of the list. So it's like, well, even though things are better, it's still a struggle.
Marginal improvement.
And what I think was interesting in Mosley's comments about the series as it goes is, and I would read this to see this progression as the timeline of Easy Rawlins progresses, we see, or a reader will see, how society is reacting to Rawlins as a detective change, in that he gains access to more parts of the community. Early in the series, there's parts of LA he can't even go. Later, he can go there, but he's going to expect to be questioned by the police. It's going to shift. And that shift in society as it's projected onto the character is really interesting. And one of the things that Mosley talks about in his interviews, and he doesn't put any of these characters, as members of his family or friends or whatever, but he does say that in the early days of the Easy Rawlins books, it's more of the point of view of the world that his father experienced. And then in the later books, he actually killed off, or potentially killed off, Easy around book 11, I believe it is. And then he brought him back. And one of the reasons he almost killed him off is because he didn't know what to do with him anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And as a writer, he had to realize that he was shifting perspective from his father's experience and then into his own experience as the character comes into the 60s.
That's really cool. It's like he almost resurrected the character and gave him a new perspective or trajectory.
I think that's very cool, and it does make me want to read more of the series again.
It's cool. It makes me think about how the similarities, but also the differences between Mosley's character here and Chester Himes and his badass cops. Chester Himes was writing about history and writing about race relations in the moment, meaning that he was putting out books talking about the civil rights while the civil rights movement in the 60s was happening. So his perspective was fresh and in that regard unfiltered or less reflective. He was reacting to what he saw in the news, especially with him living in France and all. But Mosley has the benefit of hindsight and reflection and this sort of astute intellect and his parents' experiences. He's writing about this past African-American experience in Los Angeles and in the United States, but with this benefit of being able to see it clearly and give it a more nuanced portrayal. I'm compelled to read the Himes Nuftet, whatever, the 9 books in that series, while also reading the Easy Rawlins series, and see how they both speak and respond to historical events and the conversation about race moving through the 60s.
I do know that Mosley, he looks at Chester Himes as one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. So
that's cool. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about Mosley's view of heroes, because he's really strong about this in his interviews, about how he's he wants to write an African-American male hero,
Yes.
not just a protagonist. And I think it's interesting because we have to look at what does Walter Mosley mean by that? Because in some ways, you could look at, we only have this one book to look at, but you could look at Easy Rawlins' actions in this book and you'd be like, well, yeah, okay, maybe he's a hero, maybe he isn't. I mean, he takes some gray actions in this. But Mosley does not just look at a hero as, somebody who sits very firmly between the lines or whatever. And he has a quote here that, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but he says, a lot of our heroes who are on battlefronts, and race relations is one of those battlefronts, have to be willing to explode into violence and willing to defend themselves. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at a hero. And I saw a lot of interviews that came out during the book tour for one of his latest books, which is Down to the River, Onto the Sea. And we're not talking about that book, but one of the things that happens in that book is a former cop who's a private detective investigates essentially an African-American man who's been found guilty of killing a police officer. And during the course of that investigation, he finds out that the police officers were intending to kill that guy. So he was basically guilty of self-defense, right? And the only reason that he was convicted of murder is because they were police officers. And it's interesting to see that Mosley equates a lot of this stuff with, the legacy of people like Mumia Abu-Jamal, a lot of the people who have been either shot or wrongfully convicted within the last few years. It goes back to the civil rights movement and people like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. And I really enjoyed hearing his discussion of what makes a hero. And I like that he's basically saying a hero is not someone who just conforms to the societal norms like a John Wayne character.
No, of course. And, we've talked about anti-heroes, and we know that the notion of the classic hero is so rooted in whatever cultural perception it's born out of, And how that's been shifted, and how we embrace heroes now that are more gray area or conflicted or actually adversaries to. I mean, look at Robin Hood. Robin Hood's a hero, but he was operating against the social norms of the day. So,
Yeah.
but it's really cool to see how, and to keep questioning and conversing about what a hero means. Easy's not like an obvious hero. Like I said, he's reluctant. He comes in and sort of works his way into things. He engages and begins to solve one thing, find this one girl, and issues and incidences get piled one on top of another, and they force him to ramp up his own activity. He doesn't just dive right in like some enthusiastic moron. He's thoughtful about it and goes, well, if this is going to happen, I have to do this. If the cops are going to beat me, I have to do this for the sake of my own well-being. So I feel like his steps are earned and believable, which makes me feel confident that Walter Mosley, even in this early stage, knows Ezekiel Rollins well. And to know your character well early bodes well for the future stories in the series. Speaking of legacy,
Well, I mean, I think we're in a difficult position with this one because he's still alive. His legacy is yet still to be written.
sure.
I'm gonna put Mosley in the category of being a living legend, because it's clear to me from this body of work, it's clear to me because of the diversity of his work, from crime fiction to science fiction to nonfiction, that he's going to have a long literary legacy. And not only is this crime fiction, as he has said in his interviews, a great way to comment on politics and the economy in America, and I think he's a very excellent commentator on race and power in America, that's going to stand the test of time. I don't have any doubt that we're going to be talking, or people will be talking about Walter Mosley's crime fiction 100 years from now. I think it's also interesting that his science fiction, and he is a big sci-fi buff. I mean, he's definitely a sci-fi geek, but his book, particularly Futureland, and I won't get into a lot of it here, but that was written in 2001. And it's a series of short stories. And those stories, at the time of writing, almost 20 years ago, he predicted a lot of the things that have only become relevant in the last, say, 3 to 5 years. His analysis of society is what allowed him to write those stories. So I think he's a powerful thinker, and somebody, I knew about, and I'm excited that I got a chance to read more about him, and somebody I'm going to pay a lot more attention to in the future.
We both found value in this book. It's special. This is a new guy. He's been on my shelf for a while, and I'm excited to just beginning to get to know him and his work and to see where these characters lead.
I think the one thing that this book has definitely done as a great thing for a first book is it has compelled us to want to read more. So on to 5-round burst. 5-round burst is where we do approximately 5 reviews in approximately 5 minutes. However, the last time we did 5 in 5 is been a long time. I think today we're going to overshoot our 5 shots. Let's go ahead and get into the reviews. First up today, I have Pirata by Patrick Hasburgh, and I'm going to put this in the category of surf noir. This came out in 2018.
Nice.
By Harper
I did not know that existed.
It is apparently a very minor subgenre. So anyway, in this book, Nick is the main character. He is a former car salesman who gets shot in the head while giving a test drive. During this, that's when he loses his eye and has to wear an eye patch, thus getting the nickname Pirata. Because of that, he has to take some meds, and he's not supposed to drive. He does so anyway, gets in a car accident with his kid, nearly kills his kid, and that ends up with him losing his family and his son, and he spirals in his job. He spirals out of control. He ends up in Mexico with a small, settlement payment, and he becomes a surfer in Mexico. Okay, there he gets involved with essentially a replacement family. He ends up involved in a murder, and he's pulled into a conflict with a drug cartel. Book, I enjoyed the surfing elements of it. I think there's a lot of good ideas in this book. And as I was reading it, I was kind of excited about it, but really when I finished this thing, I think it's a wave that you surfed, but maybe didn't get the best ride. You maybe should have waited for a different swell to come in. Yeah, there's something missing in this book for me. So Pirata is a miss.
My first entry this episode is a classic. I'm going old school here. It's The Dain Curse by Dashiell Hammett. I read it while I was on vacation with Kurt in San Francisco this past summer, and it was really fun to read it while staying in the city where it was written. This is Hammett's second and final Continental Op novel, and this one pulls from the best aspects, I think, of Red Harvest and serves as a nice bridge between Harvest and the Maltese Falcon. It was published in '29 by Knopf, and what happens is this, in short. The Continental Op is investigating a diamond theft from the Leggett family of San Francisco. The plot revolves around a supposed curse on the Dain family. Leggett's wife is a Dain, and her daughter is Gabrielle, and Gabrielle is connected to a local cult and has an addiction to morphine. This book feels like it's under the influence of morphine. It has this weird, brooding ghostliness to it. It was serialized in Black Mask in 4 parts, like so many of those early novels, and it does an okay job of hiding the seams, but I still notice where they were. Gabrielle breaks free from the cult, gets married to a guy named Collinson. Some people wind up dead. Is it the curse, as Gabrielle thinks, or is there something else at play? At the end, the op figures it out and helps Gabrielle, and things get better as they do in these stories. I think that this is a really cool book. I think the op was really played up well. I think this is, I guess you call it the op's best moment for me. And it's clear that Hammett is a master. This is creme de la creme of hard-boiled storytelling, and it's definitely a hit for me. I was really happy to have gone back to this older book and been like, oh, does it stand up? And it definitely does.
I'm going to a classic as well. I'm going to do a quick review of The Friends of Eddie Coyle. This is by George V. Higgins. Originally came out in 1970. I read the 40th anniversary edition from 2010 on Picador Press. It's been called one of the greatest crime novels ever written. It follows the story of Eddie Coyle, who is a small-time gun runner on the streets of Boston, and what follows is a story of basically everyone from the gun runners and the mobsters to the police, double-crossing everyone else. Now, this book is one of those that, again, you'll run across a lot of people referencing it. As I said, they call it one of the greatest crime novels ever written, and it's known for its great dialogue. I can't say that I love this.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if this is one of those things that you needed to read at the time. I mean, it's good. It's not great. The dialogue, now the guy who wrote this is a prosecutor, and he had access to a lot of the actual tape of Boston gangsters talking to each other. That's probably why his dialogue is considered so good. So for that element, I think it's worth a read. It's worth a read if you're interested in the history of crime fiction. It stands up to that. It's a hit. If you're just looking for a good book, then I'm going to say it's a miss. I'm not sure that this stands up.
I have one that is not quite a classic now, but I think that eventually it will be. It was put out in 2001, and it's Dennis Lehane's Mystic River. And I mentioned this in the last episode in commentary on one of our featured reads, which was also a Boston Grit story. Now, this book is tight. I think it's tough, gritty, insightful, and intense. It was written by Lehane, published by William Morrow, and it tells the story of 3 boys, now men, who grew up together in working-class Boston: Dave Boyle, Sean Devine, and Jimmy Marcus. Early on, we see Dave get abducted as a child by child molesters, and much of the story that follows builds on this catalyzing moment in the life of all 3 of these characters. It was turned into a film by director Clint Eastwood, and most people know it by the film and not the book. I have not seen the film, and I look forward to seeing it because it was a good film, too. It won a lot of awards. Sean Penn won an Oscar for his performance. Tim Robbins was nominated for his role as Dave. And Clint Eastwood, I believe, won Best Director, or at the very least, he was nominated. But the book itself is good on its own, sort of like how No Country for Old Men is a good book, a very good book, and a great film. I assume that this is the same type of situation. It's terrific crossover crime fiction. It has the mainstream thriller mystery appeal, but the writing is also very literary. It's taut prose that takes us into the psychological and moral terrain of these three men who find that their past not only shapes their future, but that the present shapes the past. Total kill shot.
I do remember the movie being quite good, and I've been interested in the book. And Dennis Lehane actually wrote the introduction to the version of The Friends of Eddie Coyle that I have. So, all right, next up, I have The Scene by Clarence Cooper Jr. This was originally written in 1960, and I have the 1996 version from Old School Books. This is an early novel of life on the streets and heroin addiction. And it's a vivid and very real look into a version or a part of Black America during that time frame. It's definitely a novel of the streets. Cooper himself was an addict. He was in and out of jail. He ultimately died of an overdose. During his life, he did turn out 7 crime fiction novels. So this is gritty. This is like a darker version of Chester Himes. I think it's pretty good. I think this is a hit. It's in the same vein of Junkie Love, I would say, because we have a book of The Scene written by someone who was there and well, survived it for a time, in this case, longer than most. It's certainly not politically correct by today's standards, but it is an interesting look at that era of heroin addiction and life on the street. I'm going to knock out 2 more reviews just to start getting caught up. The next one I have here is The Boise Longpig Hunting Club by Nick Kolakowski. I think that's how you say it. This came out in 2018 from Down and Out Books. It follows Jake, who is an Idaho bounty hunter, who finds a dead body in his gun safe. And because he's a bounty hunter, he thinks somebody is trying to send him a message. So he tries to investigate this on his own because he doesn't trust the police. He invokes the help of his criminal sister, who is a gun runner herself. His sister's name is Frankie. And actually, Frankie is probably the best character in the book. Now, what happens here is this unfolds a bigger conspiracy of the local sort of bigwigs. And if you have any idea what the term long pig stands for, you'll know that is a slang term for a human being. So the title sort of gives away what's going to happen in this book. And I think that's a kind of a problem because it's such a short book. So yeah, they end up in this sort of situation where a bunch of businessmen are going to hunt them, and they have to evade these fellows in the wilderness, and chaos ensues. Now, this one is kind of a miss for me. I think this is sort of in that vein of, I didn't love this book, but I think some of the things that the author shows in this book means that I'm going to pay attention to the next book that comes out from him. All right, and my last selection, now this is a book that comes straight from one of our really stupid mysteries. This is...
It's just Henry Thoreau and Ralph Emerson. Did somebody write that already?
It's almost as ridiculous because this is Hope Never Dies, an Obama-Biden mystery. And on the cover, we have a convertible car with Joe Biden at the wheel and Obama standing up and pointing forward.
Oh, my Lord.
Yes, this came out in 2018 from Quirk Books, and it is quirky indeed. It's told from the point of view of Joe Biden, and this happens after the presidency, of course, and Joe Biden is more or less fiddling around at the house, feeling that Obama has left him for bigger and better things, when he finds out that an old pal of his who works a conductor on the Amtrak has been killed. Joe doesn't believe this, so he goes to investigate, and it's possibly related to heroin. So what actually, as goofy as this sounds, it kind of works, and it is entertaining. Biden actually works as a detective. There's something about him that works. Bringing Obama into this is kind of ridiculous and superhero-ish because he sort of swoops in with his Secret Service protection and then comes out and comes back in. He kind of serves as almost like a Q character or something along those lines. It almost would have been better if it had just been Biden by himself. Now, it is, like I said, it sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. That all said, the author of this is Andrew Shaffer, and he makes it work somehow. I was entertained. I would probably read the second one. It's got the right phrase of or the right amount of over the top to make it work.
Does Biden like smoke cigarettes and get into fistfights? Because that's what I want to see.
Yeah, no, he gets into fistfights.
All right.
There's a number of things. I don't think he smokes cigarettes in here. Obama smokes cigarettes in this. But no, Biden is just goofy enough and like definitely playing on that everyman Joe sort of thing that was part of his image. But
Yeah.
it comes through. You know, it works. Like he makes a believable detective who just sort of falls into the role.
I considered you a brave soul for taking that one on. I would suspect it not really paying dividends, but cheers to you for reading it. And the fact that it wasn't actually that terrible is refreshing to hear.
The only reason I read it is because I was flying home from work. Had read everything I had brought with me for work. And, you know, I needed something on the plane, and I picked it up and I finished it by the time I landed. You know, it entertained me. So I feel like I got my money's worth.
I can't believe it was an actual book. I figured it was something like a 99-cent Kindle.
This is a physical book that I purchased at an airport bookstore.
No shit. Man, they've set that bar really low.
Anybody can get published these days, Justin.
Oh, no. Let's wrap up and get the hell out of here and go have our wintertime.
Sounds good. Well, thanks again for listening to Point Blank. Our next episode is going to be In a Lonely Place, so you might want to check that one out ahead of time. And you can always go to our Goodreads group that was started by our wonderful listener, Jeff, and you can make some comments about In a Lonely Place. And if we get those comments ahead of when we record, we can have a few things to say during the episode with your comments. If you want to get to Goodreads and make a comment, please do so. Otherwise, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook at Point Blank, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com, or you can tweet us at pointblanknoir.
That's the case. And also, if you like the show, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your enemies, tell strangers even. Give us a rating on iTunes or any of the other devices that offer ratings because it boosts our self-esteem and gives us motivation to continue. And also, if you want to donate to us and help keep us alive or help us to break even, you can go to our Patreon website. I think you can find a link on our Facebook page and eventually on the Goodreads page as well.
Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, have a good one.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.